there. Hey, Tom.
Hey, how are you, Julie?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you. It's a beautiful day out there.
It's a beautiful day out there. Thanks, everyone who's listening. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This is our first episode of How They Do It, Tech in the Cities. I'm one of your hosts. I'm your co-host, Julie Samuels. I'm the president and CEO of Tech NYC, and I'm here with...
Tom Allen. I'm the publisher and founder of City and State. And before we get into our episode, I just want to say a big thanks to our generous sponsors, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, and Snapchat. Thank you all for supporting this.
So today we're really going to talk about technology on public transit. Specifically, we're going to talk with Jamie Torres-Springer and Jesse Lazarus from the MTA about the rollout of Omni. And part of why I'm so excited about this conversation is because Omni kind of feels like a miracle. It just works. And that's kind of rare with technology in government, and that really got us thinking, like, what is it about the rollout of Omni that worked so well? Why did it work so well? What lessons are there when we think about applying technologies to other areas of government?
Listen, I remember when we had tokens in New York. I'm that old. And it was a big thing to go to Metro cards. And now, my daughter's like, Dad, you're buying Metro cards still? So the contactless payments things are amazing.
After we spoke with Jamie and Jesse, we also spoke with Jillian Gillette and Greg Fair, both from California, who've been working on Cal ITP, which is California's open payment system that they're using statewide. It was just interesting to hear a bit about what's happening in California. Obviously, the scope and the scale of their public transit system does not even come close to the MTA scale, but it's still great to get a sense of how they're thinking about it out there.
No, it was interesting to hear how they integrated a very complex system and use technology to really make it seamless for people to travel from in the biggest state in America.
I mean, that's the point of this entire podcast series. It's the point of much of the work I do. It's figuring out how these new technologies can make cities, can make states work better for the people who live in them.
Exactly. And transportation, we all know, needs as much help as it can get.
I think this conversation is even more important in light of what's been going on in New York lately, with obviously the delay of congestion pricing, what that means for funding the MTA, what we can and should be doing to make sure that New Yorkers are able to access as much public transportation as possible.
Exactly.
There's still a lot that we can focus on that's working here.
Right. I mean, technology has worked, obviously. When Uber came to New York, that was a revolutionary thing. But it's been many, many years since Underground had a technological leap. And Omni really has been a very impressive thing. And it'll be interesting to hear what Jamie and Jessica have to say about that.
One question for you, Tom. We talked about this a little bit in the podcast. What do you think about cell service underground between stations? Do you want it or no?
Very much so. Limit it in schools, expand it on the subways.
I agree.
I can't tell you how many times I get calls from a doctor or something important, one of my colleagues, and I'm like, I'm on the subway, so if we get cut off, and then by the time I finish my sentence, I'm cut off because I'm going through some tunnel.
Hopefully that will be next. So thank you guys both so much for being here. I'm really excited about this conversation. I think what I'll do is just quickly ask you two to introduce yourselves, and then we'll kind of dive in and talk about what's going on with the MTA and technology, with the subway and technology. There's a lot there. So Jamie, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I'm Jamie Torres-Springer. I'm the president of the MTA Construction and Development Agency. We're the independent agency part of the MTA that's responsible for delivery of our $55 billion capital program.
And Jesse?
Great. I'm Jesse Lazarus. I lead commercial initiatives at the MTA. So thinking about how we are accelerating Omni adoption for users and thinking about the right commercial model for a variety of initiatives, including the contactless fare payment system.
Great. Thank you both again for coming on today. I want to start with Omni. Part of why I wanted to have this conversation at all is because I think Omni is such a great example of technology just working. And the rollout, it's new, right? Omni is new, and every day people are just walking through the subway turnstiles, paying with their phone, paying with their watch. It has fundamentally changed the way we do something with a pretty seamless rollout from where I sit. So I was hoping you could just kind of frame the conversation a little bit, talk a bit about the rollout of Omni and kind of where we are in that cycle.
Sure. So in 2017, the MTA signed a contract to deliver modern contactless fare payment to all customers and throughout the system. And in the intervening years during the pandemic, largely, the MTA installed those validators that you just talked about, those contactless tap readers on every single subway stern tile and in every bus. Customers are obviously voting with their feet or with their fares, as we like to say. We're at almost 50% of all of our ridership using contactless fare payment. But if you think about it in the context of what we were trying to replace and what we were trying to accomplish with this, the Metro card system that everyone knows, it's sort of an iconic brand, really. I think it was first introduced in 1993, and it was really advanced and ahead of its time back then. But that's a really old system. And so this idea of conceiving a system that would make fare payment easy and seamless and convenient and financially flexible is something the MTA was looking at for a long time. As a part of that journey and just looking at market trends and the way that our operations have evolved since then, Omni is really meant to accomplish a few things. One is to respond to the opportunity for customers to use what's in their phones or in their pockets already to pay their fare. So it's an open loop system, meaning you don't need something from the MTA to ride with us. You can just tap and go. It's also responding to a decline in cash in the system. So I think one story that really illustrates this, when we thought about, there's fare increases at the MTA every 2 years or sort of on a regular cadence. And the MetroCard equipment and the MetroCard vending machine equipment that everybody who has a MetroCard has to go to and has to use has some limitations. Basically, there's only a fixed number of dimes and a fixed number of quarters in that system or in those vending machines. And so to have ultimate flexibility in how we price our fares, you're sort of hamstrung based on how many coins and what the ratio of those coins could be. So it became sort of an interesting operational question when thinking about, can you set a fare that's under a denomination that has a quarter or a dime? Our fare is $2.90 now. We really had to take a look at, can the MetroCard vending machines actually support that? It turns out because cash has fallen in the system, it can, but this sort of need for, I tell that story really to illustrate the need for a modern system that gives the MTA ultimate flexibility to meet our customers with the fare products that they need and want, but also to set the policy that's in the best interest of the agency. So Omni it's hardware. It's a bunch of new vending machines that don't have those same constraints. We can actually recycle bills and we can do things to support cash customers and folks who need to use the equipment. But it's also the ability to really get the MTA out of the vending machine business as much as makes sense and have a footprint and a system that is able to support sort of the modern user and the opportunity for digital payments to help us improve our operations and the customer experience.
One thing you said that kind of just stuck with me, it's a small thing, but I hadn't really thought about it before, is that the Omni, what's the noun?
The validator?
Yeah, the validators. Yeah. That they were largely installed during COVID.
Yeah.
And it has felt so magical to me, but I realized I probably missed the installation. I wasn't there the day they were installing them because I was probably in my apartment, not taking the subway. But that also speaks to how hard it is, I think, to do the kinds of upgrades you need to do on a 24/7 system. I mean, Jamie, that's kind of a tea for you to talk a little bit about how you think about that.
Yeah, that's right. We have a 100-year-old system. It's massive. It's certainly the largest in North America, one of the largest in the world, but also one of the oldest in the world. We got 472 stations. So when you talk about those fare control areas and those validators, we have thousands and thousands of validators that had to be installed. And every act of installing a new piece of technology on that old system requires just an enormous amount of coordination. So you're right. One of the reasons Omni is so amazing is we installed a validator on every single turnstile and every bus and got it done by December 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic. And it's working really effectively. The other sort of big attribute, Jesse talked about it, but the thing that really sets it apart is, in a sense, we leapfrogged a lot of technology, which is actually something that we do periodically. I'm happy that we're doing it with train control in the system as well. But we had MetroCard, which was a swipe. You had to fill it up in advance. You had to make judgments about how often you were going to ride the train. Other systems in the world started to adopt this technology that was contactless, but through a closed loop, right? It meant that you had to, everybody knows you buy the Charlie card, you buy the, forget what the WMATA card is called at this second. We moved past that. We leapfrog. We never did a closed loop, tap card. We went straight to open loop where you're able to tap your credit cards, and people are taking us up on it. Right now, we've enabled everyone who pays a full fare, which is not it's probably the majority of our subway riders, but there's a lot of people who are on special programs, students, reduced fares, fair fares, paratransit riders, that sort of thing. They're all getting onto Omni over the next year, but everyone who pays a full fare can do it. And I think, Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, we're probably at 75% adoption.
Yeah, it's 76 this
76,
month,
there you go.
Yeah.
By people who can pay a full fare, they're using that open loop to tap in. And it is a miracle. It's extraordinarily convenient. It's especially a miracle that we've grafted that onto a 100-year-old system.
One thing that also struck me about what you said is that the swipe cards were implemented in 1993. And that's an old system, but I think sadly, and probably a lot of people listening to this, that doesn't sound that old.
Yeah.
I remember 1993 very well.
Exactly.
And so, but I imagine the coins, the tokens were around for significantly longer. And as the pace of technology moves quicker, as the need to replace and upgrade speeds up just because of technology speeding up, what does that mean for such a large agency, for such a large system? How do you all think about the speed of technology? Jamie, maybe you first and then Jesse.
It's one of our bigger challenges, and I pull back a little bit from Omni to, just if you think about what's happening with technology in our system, taking that 100-year-old system, to me, sort of any genius can invent a new technology like, the iPhone from scratch, but innovation requires figuring out how to actually deploy it on top of all these other old systems. At this point, if you walk into a subway station, if you just think about it, you're walking in, there's real-time information on screens. You've got the Omni, validator, the tap in on Omni. You get onto the platform. We've got help points installed that are directly connected to our rail control center and security services. Screens all over the platform. The countdown clocks, which we're gradually moving towards LED countdown clocks. And then you get on the train, we got a lot of that same technology, and the trains are running through the major investment that we're making on what's called communication-based train control, which is, I'm happy to get into it in a lot more detail, but the point is it makes service a lot more reliable, a lot more efficient, allows us to move up speeds. So we're implementing all that technology, but that all sits on a backbone. Basically, every station has a comms room, a communications room. There's miles and miles of fiber optic cable, radio cable, copper cable, all the antennas, all the equipment that's needed to support all of that is what we've been installing in this system. And we probably spend about 10% of our capital budget on average on that technology. But the answer to your question is, we gotta make sure that backbone's in place. And that backbone is all connected now to our rail control center where it can be centrally managed. So when new technology comes up, we can implement it in the system on top of all that because it can communicate. And telecoms is really the key to modern communications at this point. So I think that's how we're prepared to keep up, is we're maintaining that backbone.
I was with my kids on the subway the other day, and I was trying to tell them how when I was young, you just didn't know when the train was going to come, and you kind of had to lean over.
Yeah.
I know.
And on the weekends, you could be waiting, you just try and see the lights, and they were
the wind blowing?
Yeah. And they were like, that's crazy.
Yeah, I know.
Totally.
I know. And even, what can I just say, even that, I mean, sort of waiting to look at the countdown clock now. I mean, I don't even do that anymore. I can sit in my apartment and figure out if the
when to leave.
The 2-3 is running on time or when the next one is, and then run to the station to grab it. So, I mean, we're even past that.
Yeah, it's real time everywhere. The other thing I would just say, so it took like 10 to 12 years to transition fully from the token to the Metro card. And I don't know about the economics for the MTA back then, but I'll tell you now, we're interested and invested in not operating two fare collection systems for very long. We obviously don't want to do that at the expense of any customer or customer experience. And so I think the MTA is pretty unique in the variety of special program and special fares that we offer. So that's really the focus for this year. Jamie talked about getting all of the half fare customers, all of the students, all of the CUNY students, all of the sort of reduced fare customers. We have a special plan to get them onto Omni so that we don't have to operate MetroCard for much longer, because that is an expensive system to keep up and to keep running. But I'd say the MTA's ability to respond to new tech trends is really also, it's a infrastructure problem, but it's also a commercial opportunity. From the commercial side, I think we have to do two things, and we are doing this. Omni is a great case study of this, and the sort of reset or rebaseline of Omni that we've recently rolled out. One is making the commercial arrangements more modular. Software is a lot different than a big construction project. Tech projects and tech contracts you don't need to boil the ocean with one big thing. In some ways that creates bloat, project delay, resource scarcity. There's obviously a variety of issues there. But the other is investing in in-house talent that if you can't build it in-house, at least you have the talent to oversee the vendors and understand how agile development works and why you wouldn't necessarily want, for example, a milestone payment schedule attached to a software contract. You'd want to have flexibility for more agile development that's customer facing and customer impacting. So over the last 12 months, Jamie's team and I have really taken a fresh look at exactly what those commercial arrangements are and how are we setting up both our commercial structures and our contracts with these vendors. How, we brought a few more vendors into the mix, and we're making sure that the incentives are properly aligned to customer impacts and when our customers and our riders really start to experience the benefits of this new fare payment system. And we're also doubling down on, I think part of this, and this is getting a little in the weeds, is on the in-house team that built the 4.9 star train time mobile ticketing app for the commuter railroads. And that is really unheard of in public sector tech. I don't think you get almost 5-star rated tech products out of the public sector all the time, but the MTA did that. And so doubling down on that team and their expertise to keep building and then also overseeing these other vendors, I think is a core part of the agility you need to keep this going.
Jamie, I've got a question for you. Something that I've been thinking about while both of you have been speaking is, I think one of the challenges that a lot of people in the private sector maybe don't understand about building technology for government, particularly at a citizen-facing service like the subway. Mm-hmm. And I thought of this when you said any genius can create an iPhone.
Slight exaggeration.
Slight exaggeration, yeah. But it's in the private sector, you can build a tool that's not for everyone. Market segmentation is a thing. Your audience is a thing. But the subway has to serve every New Yorker. So when you're trying new things, when you're thinking about what it looks like, you have to make sure it still works for everybody. Mm-hmm. I think that's a challenge that, again, a lot in the private sector don't have to deal with as much. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how that plays out in your work.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we are always having to implement universal technology solutions in the system. So it's what makes it so much more challenging. Jesse said it, but that was where we were at the end of 2020. We were able to put a system into place where folks that had regular fare payment that just paid the $2.90 to get on the train and that had a contactless credit card that, was in their wallet or that they were putting in their digital wallet. Those were the folks that were able to use Omni. Everybody else had to struggle through getting a Metro card. That's not good enough in our system. So what we've spent the last year, a little more than a year doing, is figuring out how we finally deliver for the rest. Install the Omni card vending machines in every station, and we're now through the pilot and they work, and we've got over 100 of them deployed in the system right now. Put into place a system, sort of the back of it is what's called a B2B portal, but that doesn't matter. The point is that we're getting all the people that have sort of special fares like reduced fares, fair fares, paratransit, people with pre-tax, cards that they get where the funds come out of their paycheck. All of those people are going to be able to use the system. And that's what we've had to, that's the mission. That's what we have to do. It's not, you're right that a lot of the decisions that we sit around and make, you say, okay, we could deploy this one thing into the system, but how is that going to work for all of these different groups? Another great example that I'll give you that's not, it's tangentially related to technology is accessibility in the system. We've made the commitment that our subway and bus system, our bus system already is accessible, that our subway system has to be accessible to all New Yorkers with physical and mental disabilities. And we've made that commitment. We settled the class action lawsuit. We're investing over $5 billion in our current 5-year capital plan. In making 67 of the 472 stations ADA accessible. We committed to get to 95% by 2055. It is an enormous expense of capital dollars, but we're doing it because we got to make sure that we welcome everybody into the system. And whenever we go and do work in our system, we're also benefiting everybody. So when you see those elevators getting built as part of our stations, it's actually amazing. The elevator cost itself is only about 10% of the average project cost. It's really, we really, as soon as you touch one of our 100-year-old stations, it almost falls apart. So we're having to go and bring the whole station up into a state of good repair in order to make it ADA accessible. And we're committed to doing that.
Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
I was going to say another example of we have to serve all customers, and the universality of the product is really around a decision a private company would make around cash in the system and cash usage. Cash has fallen 60% in the last 5 years, and that is accelerating. That slowdown is accelerating, but it's never going to get to zero. There is an asymptote. The MTA's got to support cash customers. So what Jamie's talking about with the OmniCard vending machines is the backbone of that, but it also means we need a retail network to support the bus dependent customers. There's a whole set of activities that we need to get right, and we need to right size and make sure it's the right footprint to support those customers. But this deployment of Omni is really the perfect time to be very targeted and precise about where we're doubling down, but creating a universal opportunity throughout the system for cash customers to have just as pleasant of an experience as somebody who you said, it just works. It's like magic. We want it to be that way for all of our customers.
One question I get a lot is connectivity in the subway. Why doesn't my phone work between stations? When's that going to happen, guys?
It's happening. It does go back to the point I made that the backbone has to get put into place, and it's very complex to do that. So I'll talk in a second about pulling fiber through the whole system, but the fiber has to connect to things. We need the comms rooms. You need to be able to get up into a base station hotel where the signal is connected to. So it's it's complicated to get the overall infrastructure into place. Speaking of commercial relationships and getting things done through public-private collaboration, which is really what we're talking about here, we entered into an agreement with Transit Wireless, which is now called Bolden. They built out the cell service in the stations for us, and we have an agreement for them to pull all of that fiber and put in the antennas to get the tunnels fully lit up over the next 10 years. It's very complicated to do it, mostly because we have a 24/7 system. So actually the currency of getting things built in our system, we call it, you'll hear the technical people call it a geo. It's an outage. It means that, everybody who, is familiar with not being able to take their train line on the weekend, that's almost always because we're doing capital work, and it means that we can't have trains running through the tunnels when we're trying to pull massive amounts of fiber cable. So we're working with Bolden now. Actually, very interestingly, we're enabling the Crosstown line, which is the G line that runs in Brooklyn and Queens. We're enabling that with modern signals, replacing the signals that were installed during the FDR presidency with a modern signaling system, and one that's communication-based, going to allow us to run the trains much more efficiently, like we've got on the 7 train and the L train now. While we're doing that this summer, and we have to do some long-term outages there, which we've been working closely with the community to make sure there are other options, we have managed to get Bolden in there too, without taking any additional time. They're going to pull all that fiber cable, so we'll be in a position to light up cell service along that portion of the G that we're working on this summer. And that's how we're getting it done.
That's amazing. I did not know the G was going to get cell service this summer.
The G will get cell service when we're ready to turn on. We're pulling the cable this summer. There's a few extra pieces that have to get put into place. But yeah, yes, soon.
Well, we're out of time. And I just want to say that I feel incredibly lucky as a New Yorker that there are people like you two who are so thoughtful about this, who have chosen to work for the MTA when obviously there's a million different things you could be doing. Okay, so super grateful for this conversation, incredibly grateful that Omni works as well as it does, and that you both and your teams are spending so much time thinking about how we modernize the system. That I should have also said at the top, people in the tech sector love the subway. People I work with take the subway every day. When you come to a Tech NYC board meeting, there are not a lot of black cars out in front. The leaders of our industry show up on the subway, on city bike, on foot. It's really in the culture of the tech sector. And when I moved back here, after spending time in the Valley, I think especially then, people really, really appreciate the way the subway just works. But we're gonna wrap this conversation, and we're gonna wrap the conversation by asking each of you for one New York book, film, piece of content that you recommend that kind of gets to the heart of something you think is interesting about New York. So Jamie, you go first.
I'm going to say 2, and we're going to have to go very old school and predictable and say that anyone who hasn't read The Power Broker needs to read it. We've had a good conversation about how an authority like the MTA functions and is able to enter into creative partnerships, hire creative people. All of that is because the authorities were created, not necessarily by Robert Moses, but during that era. And there's certainly some downsides, but anybody that hasn't read that book needs to read the book and just get themselves through it. I also much more recently, a good friend of mine, someone became a good friend during work on resiliency, and particularly during the pandemic. Eric Kleinenberg wrote a great book called 2020, where he sort of followed around, I think, 8 people during the pandemic in 2020. And, New York has sort of been built and evolved on these crises. I mean, for me, 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, and then the COVID pandemic have been hugely formative. 9/11 was sort of what led me to move to the city, but then the other 2 have been enormously formative in my career and my personal life and my love for the city. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And Eric's done a great job of looking at sort of people from all walks of life who have had different experiences during that year.
Great. I think mine's a little more classic and old school, but I grew up not in New York, but always in admiration and sort of awe of New York City. I grew up on a farm in East Tennessee, where if you want to talk about technology, it was like, is the electric fence working or not? So that was my full exposure. But when I moved to New York over 10 years ago, I read for the first time E.B. White's Here is New York, and I really identified with that third kind of New Yorker, the person who's not born here but moves here because they're just completely in love with the idea of a city and being a part of it. So that, and then the companion to that, I suppose a bit more contemporary, is Fran Lebowitz, Pretend It's a City. I feel that way all the time. I feel that way when we're on the subway together, packed in. I feel that way walking down the sidewalk. I really appreciate the concept of that phrase, and also, of course, the humor of which she attacks it.
Well, thank you both so much for spending the time and really good book tips. Thank you.
Great.
Spectrum is committed to expanding digital opportunity to more people across the country. With the Spectrum Digital Education Grant, we're able to fund organizations that are working to better their local communities through access, training, and technology labs, including professional advancement opportunities for adults and educational workshops for seniors, as well as providing resources for students. We're Spectrum, working together to advance digital inclusion and empower the future. Service not available in all areas. Restrictions apply.
Well, it's so great to have Jamie and Jesse here to talk a little bit about what's going on at MTA. It's so great to have them working on this issue, I should say.
Yeah, and now we're lucky enough to be able to talk to people who are doing something similar in California, but in a much more complex system.
So Jillian, she's the chief of the Division of Data and Digital Services at Caltrans, which is the state's Department of Transportation. And Greg, who's also joining us, is the Digital Identity Chief and Chief Product Officer in the state's Department of Technology Office of Digital Services. He also comes from Google and has spent a bunch of time building tech in the private sector.
And we hear so much about California being a dysfunctional state these days, but it's really great to see that there's something really working well in California.
I guess my first question is, in the process of bringing contactless pay to California, congratulations on that. How did the programs in other cities like New York and Chicago sort of inform your approach? Did you take any leads from those?
New York's transition to contactless payments is rather like Transport for London's, which went first. Transport for London had always wanted to go to open payments. That was part of their bid for the Olympics in 2010, but the technology just wasn't there yet. So they had to do what's called a closed loop card first, the Oyster card, which is a lot like the Omni card or the other plastic cards that you see in other systems. Our approach was different in that there are many transit agencies in California. There are 253 fixed route agencies, A to B, B to A. And then if you add in all the smaller nonprofits that provide paratransit, et cetera, there's about 800 agencies. So many of them are very small and they don't really need a complex back office. It's not really clear who does need a complex back office anymore since contactless payments has become really prevalent. But we wanted a the thinnest possible back office so that we could standardize as many agencies.
Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the state of affairs? Are all of the systems in the state that you just talked about, are they all online with contactless payments now?
No. So the departments of transportation in the United States are sort of prime recipients for federal funds, and then the DOTs dole out or make grants to the sub-recipients, which is the smaller agencies in that state, right? So we're a fiduciary of the smaller agencies, and so that's our market share, and so that's who is working most prevalently directly with us. It's a teeny tiny industry, but the largest agencies have these legacy systems. So they've all agreed to go contactless or to go to open payments one way or the other, but they're all doing it their own way.
Yeah, and that's part of what we saw from the state side as we were looking at how we can do authentications for some of the additional layers that we were really interested in around confirming eligibility for different kinds of benefits, whether they are mandated ones or federally mandated ones or ones that are specifically desired by the municipal agencies. And as we look at all of those transit agencies across the state of California and the many other applications for this kind of technology, we were excited to work with Jillian and the Integrated Travel Project team, because California, like New York, big, complex state, tons of different agencies, tons of different use cases, tons of different types of people, and trying to build a system that 100% of eligible, service seekers can access is actually much more challenging in large populations of really diverse states. And so we looked, back to the original question around who are we considering other cities, really it was a conversation with other countries from our perspective. We spoke with other countries about their digital access systems and how they built them. And kind of took those for inspiration.
Which countries are those?
You name a modern country with a digital system, we probably talked to them.
Greg, I've got a question for you because you came from the private sector. You were at Google, right? Just before you came to
Was for about a
DOT.
decade.
Yeah, it's obviously really different to do this kind of work in the public sector than in the private sector. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what that transition was like for you and how you kind of think about that now that you're on the public side.
Yeah, I think that one of the great things that a lot of people talk about working at Google, and something I always hear from folks when they're interviewing and coming in, is that they want to come in and make an impact and do something that really affects positive change for a lot of people. And I think in the time that I had working at Google, and a big chunk of that was leading the privacy product team, is that the real way to make an impact for good at scale is actually engaging with government. The conversations that I would have, particularly with European regulatory bodies and governments, but now with the US more so in the last number of years, we're seeing that's where a lot of the change is driving from. And so from that perspective, I think the scale and the scope and the intent about trying to really do something good and at scale is pretty similar. I think there's an operational difference. At Google, certainly we built a lot of things ourselves. We wanted to do that. We could spin up projects pretty quickly, but then, getting it out took a lot of work. You get it kind of ready to go and then have a lot of conversations. I think at the state, it's a little bit the opposite. It takes a while to spin things up. But once you have it going, things move actually. So I've been impressed with the state of California, how once we collectively make a decision to move on something, it actually moves forward with relative pace.
Was the governor squarely behind this program? And was his office involved in supporting it?
Our program came about as part of a budget BCP, a budget change proposal, funding specifically a digital identity pilot. And so my role was funded through that. And one of the first things we realized when I came in, we did a survey of the landscape. We recognized that the best kind of pilot is something that focuses not just on sign-in around digital identity, but also making sure there's eligibility for different discounts and services and benefits across the state, because that's why the government exists, for validating identity, right? We're really here in terms of services to make sure people can access services. So the governor's office was very excited about the direction we were headed, because it's very well aligned with the governor's desire to reach underserved population, service, access and equity issues, and we can talk more about that. But it's a pretty wonderful approach we've taken, and transit is a really obvious, working ground for that kind of effort, because you're touching on a lot of populations that maybe are underserved in any number of ways.
I was going to say, in my case, the governor's office, supports high-speed rail, and sort of the CalITP came out of the 2018 state rail plan, right, which proposed two questions. Like, one is, could we have a network in California so that people could make any trip that they wanted across the state, right? Do we have a network? And the answers were, actually, there's very little infrastructure missing. There's a little bit, but what we have is that nobody works together, and therefore it's really hard to pay. So calling out payment, the inability to pay across systems, is a really old problem that's been acknowledged by multiple governors. And so, I think if you look at our competition, right, our competition is the car. And we can give you a driver's license in California, and you can use it in New York, and vice versa. You could give somebody with a disability, a disabled placard in New York, and you can use it in California. If I give you a transit discount, your senior discount at the MTA in New York City, you can only use it at the MTA in New York City, right? Even though the Federal Transit Administration requires those discounts of agencies all across the country, we haven't ever thought about it at this level. Really putting the customer first and saying, let's remove all of the barriers for the customer, many of which were already removed in the car space, right? We've done this before, we just haven't thought about it in this arena.
New York and the MTA have a big problem with fare evasion, right? There's about $700 million estimated in fare evasion just in New York City alone, on the subways and particularly on the buses. I'm told that very few people pay on buses these days. Is that a problem in California? And has there been any program that you've tried to combat that?
Sure, it's a problem in certain agencies that they have a high fare box recovery, and they have different methods for dealing with it. Sometimes fare evasion is criminalized. In general, it's been decriminalized. So there are various different, some agencies will have sheriffs doing fare enforcement, and some agencies will have ambassadors doing fare enforcement. I think the problem on the bus is that for a long time, we've kind of just dumped all of this on the operator of the bus, right? Operating a bus in an urban environment is incredibly complicated. To put the operator in the position of collecting fares is, an added headache that frankly they don't need. So I think, countries that are better at this, that have better transit, use proof of payment sort of fare enforcement. They have fare enforcers who come on and do spot checks, right? And you don't have to do too many of those before people start paying. And, that's not the way that we do it here in the US. We either leave it to the drivers or we have police come in and do it. So, it's very easy under open payments to verify if somebody's paid or not. So, it's not a technical problem.
Speaking of open payments, I want to get back to Cal ITP really quickly. Do you all know the data? Have more people been using public transit since Cal ITP came online?
So it is difficult for us to, given the amount of data that we have right now, to show increases in ridership. I know that New York City can directly attribute a 10% ridership bump in 2019 to open payments. I mean, it seems so obvious that, if you just make it easy for people and it makes it less confusing, that it's going to increase ridership. But, we started implementing during COVID, so it's hard to, divide the general, coming back, whatever that means, to the office from contactless payments.
I was just going to say, what has been the general feedback from riders in terms of the user experience?
So the riders love it. I mean, the agencies love it. The bus drivers love it because it gets them out of the fare, the bus operators, because it gets them out of the fare collection business. And I would say that the seniors who are benefiting from the discount that we're able to give them automatically, courtesy of the work that that Greg and his team have been doing, are thrilled. Their ridership, their numbers are going up dramatically.
One of the interesting things when we spoke to the MTA, one of the things I found interesting is what I hadn't thought about, even though I was in New York City during the whole period, is that they were able to change a lot of the hardware during COVID when a lot of us weren't riding the subway. And I think for a lot of us who weren't coming into the office during the height of the pandemic, and then we started coming back in and getting on the subway, it was like magic. All of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, this all of a sudden is totally, I wasn't even here for the construction. But I think from California's perspective, your timing didn't align that way, or did it?
Well, so with the small agencies that we started with, it totally did. That's how we started doing it during the middle of COVID. And contactless payments in a smaller agency that isn't transitioning from a legacy system, it's no big deal, right? I mean, a coffee shop or a dry cleaner can become a Square merchant in under a week, and they just plug in the little box, right? Like that, to some extent, that's all we're really doing is putting point of sale terminals on buses. So the installation, I think I heard one of the agencies present the other day, they now have installation down to about 10 minutes a bus.
Oh, that's amazing.
Wow.
I've got another question about the data that you all are able to collect now, which I understand it's really interesting. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So first of all, you get data essentially in real time this way, right? And the second is that while the payment card industry is regulated for privacy and security under the banking laws, et cetera, and therefore you can't see the actual customer account information, which kind of wigs out some of the transit agencies because they're used to seeing that, but don't need it. A bank card gives you a lot of information from the get-go right? You can tell you can tell from your card mix whether you have, what the percentage of credit card versus debit card folks is, right? And in the United States, you can tell somebody's income essentially from how they pay, right? Wealthy people pay with credit cards. Sort of middle class, what's left of it, or lower income people tend to pay with debit cards, and then the super poor supposedly, pay with cash. Super poor meaning people that make under $27,000 a year. That cohort uses more cash than the other cohorts combined, according to the FDIC's most recent study, right? So you can tell your card mix. Then when you look at the debit cards, at the debit cohort, you can tell from the issuer more about your customers too. So if you can tell from the front 5 numbers who the issuer, a bunch of things, including who the issuer is. So if you see your percentage of Venmo, Cash App, PayPal increasing relative to other commercial bank account debit cards, that tells you almost certainly are reaching a much lower income population, because those are products that don't require a minimum balance. And therefore, that's one of the reasons why Cash App, I think, is up to 53 million people now, right? Because the minimum balance is so onerous. So then other information that you can see, obviously you can start to see the use by the discount groups in real time. So once we really finish, all of the categories, we should be able to see the impact of students on systems in real time, which is a big deal, because sometimes that can make vehicles really crowded. And then the networks have access to information about our customers that we can never have, which is, what do our customers like outside of transit? And you can purchase that from them. In some instances, some of the networks are providing some of that data to other agencies in other countries for free, right? Because, at least in the Bay Area, you can make transit free here and it's not going to cause more ridership. Like, that's not what's going to get people on trains and buses in the Bay Area. But, if you give people a 20% discount off of, a Starbucks coffee or something, that might get them onto a bus or train. So that's the kind of information that you can get that is much more powerful. I mean, I think transit is so hung up on owning the customer that we forget that we are we're kind of a blip on the economy, right? We're less than 0.5% of the economy, and 60% of transit in the United States is, New York's. We don't really, yes, we should make our existing customers happy, but we don't have very many of them. Why don't we start paying attention to the, most people who don't take transit, right? Like, most Americans just don't even think about taking transit. What's up with that? So that's where open payment data gets to be really useful.
And the flip side of that question, by the way, and this is, from the digital identification side and how we think about this, is actually the opposite. And part of the way the system that we built is unique, as far as we understand, unique certainly within the country. And in many ways, from what we've talked to and we've spoken to other countries, also unique to them, because we built a system that essentially ensures that only the barest minimum of data gets through to the transit agencies in this case. Because what we find is while they're not used to not having the data, once we talk through why they have all these pieces of data, do they need an account with a transit agency? Do they need a bunch of personal information about somebody? The answer is actually no in the vast majority of cases, and certainly for the cases around just validating eligibility for a service discount, right? So that then frees these agencies to do the things that they're really good at, which is delivering on transit. And we are making sure that no data gets passed through, or even we don't even store that data ourselves. And I think this moves us towards the issues of digital access and access to these discounts on transit that I've been really impressed with the program and how they approached it. And one of the things that Jillian didn't mention is that for those who are unbanked, who didn't have existing cards, the system's facilitated a way for them to get access to a debit card they might not have had before. And then another piece of data that comes out of that, anonymized, of course, or at least from our perspective in terms of the scale of the information, you can see that people who didn't have access to digital payments in the past are now using those digital payments in all the places you would expect and want them to be able to. Drugstores, supermarkets, right? It doesn't need to just be used on transit. So when you give somebody a dedicated card that can only be used on transit, it has to be preloaded, right? It can only use one place. But if you give somebody a reloadable card that can be used anywhere, it becomes an entree into the digital payment system. And that's obviously very important for everyone to be able to move into, a digital economy.
That's so cool. I love that. There's for a long time in New York, we've been thinking a lot, obviously, about digital payments as a policy matter. And many years ago now, the city council here passed a bill that requires retail establishments and food establishments to take cash.
Gosh, yeah.
Yeah. And at the time, I mean, I understand why,
Sure.
but it also kind of drove me crazy because it was like, shouldn't we be trying to get more people access to modern tools of payment instead of,
Right.
it felt like we were using our energy to go the wrong way. And what you are saying, Greg, is the exact opposite of that. It's like, let's find the entry points to get more people access to the modern tools of today's economy.
But financial inclusion, like
Right.
Yeah.
the way that you count in the United States is to have a credit rating, right? Other countries don't have credit rating agencies. They use alternative forms of data to establish whether or not you are, they should take a risk on you. But in the United States, do it by credit ratings. And, most of the people that government serves have thin or no credit ratings. So I think I understand requiring cash for a while, but it's patronizing. I mean, I grew up super, super poor, and I don't really know anybody that wanted to use cash. It's dangerous to hold cash out on the street. And it's better to be financially included.
This conversation, this piece of it is so interesting to me. And it's why I do all this work I do, because technology is the entry point for can be the entry point for a lot of these things. And I think a lot of times when we think how governments apply and implement new technologies, it's so different than the private sector because you have to make sure it works for everyone. Like, Greg, at Google, the products you were building, they didn't have to work for everyone. They only had to work for Google customers. But government has a different mandate, obviously. And I worry that sometimes in government, because of the political climate, there's a fear of technology. And I understand why. But I think that could be really unfortunate because if you are more open to thinking about how we can implement technologies in government, you can better address things like, for instance, financial inclusion, like you're talking about right now. And in this context, technology is part of it's not the whole answer, but it is absolutely part of the answer.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where we felt that focusing first on the edge cases was actually the better approach. And it's not a naturally obvious approach to doing these things, but if you focus on those edge cases, you end up building something that is available for everyone. We can cover the 80% case, and then call it the 70% case really these days. Edge cases in California are pretty huge. But making sure we spend the extra effort to touch on these other populations ended up building, it changes the way you design a system, frankly. And that's why we ended up doing it the way we have. And I see a ton of benefit, not just in terms of the system, the privacy of the system, the flexibility of the system, the openness of it, but the thing that I wasn't aware of and have learned more about as we've gone through these efforts with transit agencies is that the systems themselves, to Jillian's point at the top when we were speaking around trying to reduce the size of the back office, aside from reducing the practical overhead and the data overhead and the management overhead, turns out the cost is a lot less too, by a lot. And that was, I think, maybe unintuitive to me coming in. It was like a hope, but as we've dived into it, we realized that as this scales, it will actually free up more money to go to the right places.
Has that reduction in operating costs been quantified?
Well, we're not at scale yet, so there's effort in a transition. Julian has numbers on if you look at line items for hardware and things like that, and we're seeing that's certainly much lower. But as it scales out and as you move from a legacy closed system into an open loop system, you can just imagine all of the different benefits that will naturally occur.
Yeah, cash is the most expensive way to collect revenue. In fact, the New York City MTA was, perhaps may still be, the largest cash depositor to the Federal Reserve System. There's a MasterCard in Brooklyn with a whole lot of money in it. And I believe that the staff there have to be escorted by, armed guards. Right, that's just crazy.
Crazy. We talked a little bit about that with MTA too, about how they have to make sure the machines have the right coin denominations if they change the price, just the logistics of the system functioning when you need pennies and nickels and dimes and quarters and dollars. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. It's hard to be polite about some of this. Like the industry, as it's a teeny tiny industry, so it's prone to vendor lock-in. So, for instance, there's, not a whole lot of competition in cash fare boxes. So cash fare boxes are now, they do exactly the same thing that they do in 1800 when they were, 1880s when they're invented. But now they have these complicated back offices to do all sorts of, fare reconciliations, and they're integrated into people's computer-aided dispatch systems, blah, blah, blah. And as a result, they cost $19,000. Right. Last time I looked up, the Square's little doodad, that you can get in a coffee shop, it was $44 on Amazon.
Right. Well, I guess that's part of the challenge with government modernization.
Well, but also like not thinking really about putting the customer's experience first, which I think is also maybe a private sector thing, right? Like we all do it for good reasons, but our regulations, we have to be true to the regulations, but regulations are interpretable. And there are regulations up and down. Like, make sure when you're saying that you're just following the regulations that you remember the other regulations, right?
Or the why, as much as possible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This has been great. I've really learned a lot, and you guys have been fantastic. I have one last question that's totally off topic, but I since we have you guys, I was curious. New York has been having, obviously, a big controversy in the last month about the implementation of congestion pricing. Has that been on the radar in California at all? And is that something that's in the offing?
Well, I think, yes, it's been on the radar here. The larger metropolitan areas are all looking at congestion pricing. And there have been various schools of thought about why to do it. And, I have my opinion, which is, selling it as a way to fund transit is not going to work. People have to believe in, first of all, I mean, the way London did it was totally different, right? They put a ton of more transit out on the street. They looked at the product first. Is the alternative really attractive? Because otherwise, you're putting people into something that they, aren't necessarily comfortable taking. The reason to do congestion pricing in Los Angeles is to stop trucks idling next to neighborhoods where there are more children than.
So is it something that you think might happen in the next couple of years, or?
Yeah, I think everybody was hoping that it would start in New York because, it's so obvious thing to do in New York. Like New York is like the least American city. It's a city of the world, right? Like it's,
right.
It has to happen in Manhattan. It's a disaster. It should have happened a long time ago, right? I used to live in New York.
I have a feeling it's going to happen in early 25, right after the elections, conveniently.
But I do think that if you're New Jersey, I would say, look at your own transit system. We should do better. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that, that the New Jersey systems don't have the same payment system as, are they all open now? Like,
they're trying to get there.
Yeah. Right. Like, we should get out of our own way. And the transit product needs to be a lot more attractive to people. It needs to be intuitive, right? People need to not have to think about how to take transit.
Well, thank you both so much for this time.
Thank you. This has been great.
Well, that was a super interesting conversation.
That was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's so important to hear what's happening, what's working in other places. None of us builds in a vacuum.
Government doesn't talk to each other. And government, really, I've always thought that New York should have an office of best practices that looks at other cities and other states, not just in America, but around the world, to see what's working. Because if it's in a Scandinavian country, I'm sure they're doing a lot better than we're doing it here.
You know, we should do a whole podcast episode just on that. I think you're totally right. I think there's this ethos in New York that we have to do everything our own way.
Right.
And that's insane.
We know it better.
That's insane. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in. Especially thanks to our sponsors, to our earliest supporters, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, and Snapchat.
And then like and subscribe to our podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and iHeart. And tell us your feedback. We'd love to hear ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.